In this video, we're going to be taking a look at the concept of stem-changing verbs in Spanish. So far in this Spanish one, we've been mainly looking at regular verbs. We've been looking at AR verbs, ER verbs, and IR verbs and how they're conjugated. If you recall, every verb in Spanish is an AR verb, an ER verb, or an IR verb. And what we did was we took off our ending, whether it be an AR, an ER, or an IR, and we added the right endings. Let's review those endings real quick because we'll actually be seeing those endings when we're working with stem-changing verbs. With the verb hablar, an AR verb, it means to talk. If you want to say I talk, you say hablo. You take off the AR and add an O. You talk, hablas. He or she talks is habla. Nosotros hablamos, we talk. Ellos hablan, they talk, or ustedes hablan, y'all talk. But again, the process was you just took off the AR and you were left with your stem, habl. You added O, as, a, amos, on, depending on who your subject is. That's how you work with a regular AR verb. Then you learn that ER and IR verbs basically follow a similar pattern. With a verb like comer, to eat, you take off the ER, you add the endings O, S, E, amos, N. You're left with that stem, com, com, como, comes, come, comemos, comen. So again, this process was simple. You took off the ER and you added the proper ER verb ending to conjugate it appropriately. And then we moved on to the third category of verbs, the IR verbs. Vivir, for example, which means to live. You took off the IR, you were left with the stem, viv. You added the right ending depending on who you were talking about. Vivo, vives, vive, vivimos, viven. And those were your endings. It was a very simple process. It is a very simple process on just taking off your ending. You leave the stem, and you add the correct endings depending on whether it's an AR verb, an ER verb, or an IR verb. And that's how regular verbs work. Now then, there's a completely different category of verbs that break this pattern somewhat. And those verbs are called stem-changing verbs. You'll still see the same set of endings on those, but they'll change a little bit. In fact, they're called stem-changing verbs because it's actually the stem, the first part of the verb, that changes a little bit. We actually have three different categories of stem-changing verbs in Spanish. Verbs can stem change in three different ways. The first category we're going to look at are a category of verbs that stem change from E to IE. What that means is the last E of the stem will change to an IE in most of their forms. Let's take a look at an example of an AR verb that stem changes. If you'll take a look at these three verbs right here you see on your screen, you'll see that actually we have AR verbs that stem change, ER verbs that stem change, and IR verbs that stem change. It's still important to keep track of whether you're working with an AR verb, an ER verb, or an IR verb to put the right set of endings. Let's take a look at empezar to begin with, appropriately enough, because empezar means to start. If you want to say I start in Spanish, if you'll take a look at your endings real quick, you still have O, as, a, amos, on, just like you did for hablar, just like any regular AR verb. Your endings don't change, it's actually the stem that changes here. If you'll take a look at the blue letters, you'll see that that E is changed to an IE. Let's take a look and see how we pronounce these. The first word that we say I start, empiezo. Repeat it, empiezo. Then we have the word you begin, empiezas. Empiezas. He begins, empieza. Empieza. The nosotros form is empezamos. We'll take a look at that in more detail. And lastly, we have empiezan. Empiezan. Repeat, empiezan. So again, your conjugation is empiezo, empiezas, empieza, empezamos, empiezan. So what you notice here, first of all, is that stem-changing verbs do have the same endings as regular AR, ER, and IR verbs. Only the stem is different. So we're not learning a whole new set of verb endings. We're learning that some verbs operate differently and they change their stem. In the case of empezar, what we saw is that the E changed to an IE. Now, if you look at the whole conjugation, you might notice something about the word empezamos. That didn't actually stem change, and there's a rule that goes along with that. The nosotros form, the we form of a stem changing verb, is always regular. The nosotros form will not stem change. So when you're conjugating a verb like empezar, which you know is stem changing now, you'll change that E to an IE, except for the nosotros form. Let's look at that again. We have empiezo, empiezas, empieza, empezamos, empiezan. That's your conjugation of the verb empezar. I start, you start, he starts, we start, they start. The endings are regular AR verb endings. You just change the E to an IE in all of its forms except for that nosotros form, the we form. Good. We'll see that ER verbs stem change as well. A verb that we've already worked with this year, but we didn't really designate it as a stem changing verb, is the verb querer. Querer means to want in Spanish. Again, we're doing the same thing. It's an ER verb this time, so our endings are O, S, E, emos, N, just like the other ER verbs that we've learned. But the E changes to an IE in most of its forms. We have quiero. Repeat. Quiero. Quieres. You want. Quieres. Quiere. Queremos. Quieren. Again, if you'll notice with the nosotros form, it doesn't stem change. The E stays the same. The nosotros form of a stem changing verb is always regular. So ER verbs can stem change this way as well. That E changed to an IE. And lastly, not surprisingly, IR verbs can also stem change this way too. We've got the verb mentir, which means to lie, to tell a lie. Mentir. Again, we see that E changes to an IE. Let's try it. Miento. Repeat. Miento. You lie. Mientes. Miente. Mentimos. Mienten. Miento, mientes, miente, mentimos, mienten. Again, notice it's an IR verb this time, so we have IR verb endings O, S, E, emos, N. And again, that E changes to an IE in all of its forms except for which one? That's right, the nosotros form does not stem change. For all three of these verbs, the nosotros form of a stem changing verb is always regular. By the way, you cannot tell by looking at a verb that it's stem changing. You have to remember that it's stem changing. You can't take a look at the word empezar by itself and say, oh, that's a stem changing verb, I can just tell. Just like in English, we have to learn the past tense of bring is not bringed, it's brought. Just like you learn the past tense of sing is not singed, but sang. Same thing in Spanish. You just have to memorize stem changing verbs that they're stem changing. So empezar, querer, and mentir are all three stem changing verbs that go from E to an IE. You just have to remember that. One way in your textbook that you can tell that it's stem changing, if you'll notice, is this verb entender, which means to understand. It's from this chapter's vocabulary. If you take a look there in parentheses after the verb entender, it has an IE. What that means is this is a verb where that second E, that last E of the stem, will stem change to an IE. That helps you when you're looking things up in a dictionary or in the glossary in the back of our textbook that it's stem changing. But ultimately, you have to remember that the yo form of entender is entiendo and not entendo. You just have to remember it. And with practice, you'll get those down. So again, if you take a look, this is our first category of verbs. In all three of these verbs, empezar, querer, and mentir, that E changed to an IE. Those are one category of stem changing verbs. As I mentioned, there are actually three different categories of stem changing verbs. Verbs that stem change from E to IE. Our second category of verbs, of stem changing verbs, are verbs that stem change from O to UE. For example, we have the verb encontrar, which means to find, the verb volver, which means to return, to come back, and the verb dormir, which means to sleep. All three of these verbs are stem changing verbs where the O in the stem will change to a UE when you're conjugating it. Notice again, we have an AR verb as an example, an ER verb as an example, and an IR verb as an example. So all three types of verbs, AR verbs, ER verbs, and IR verbs, can stem change in this way. Let's take a look at the verb encontrar. Encontrar means to find. The way you say I find is not encontro, you have to change the stem. It's encuentro. Try it. Encuentro. Then we have encuentras, encuentra, encontramos, encuentran. Again, you notice a couple of things. What kind of verb endings do we have here? Again, stem changing verbs have the same endings as regular AR, ER, and IR verbs, only the stem is different. So again, the stem is what changed, but your endings are still o, as, a, amos, an, because it's an AR verb. Okay? And again, we also see that the nosotros form of that stem changing verb is regular. It doesn't change to UE, it stays in O. The nosotros form of a stem changing verb is always regular. Encuentro, encuentras, encuentra, encontramos, encuentran. Good. ER verb, volver, to return. Same thing. You have your ER verb endings, o, s, e, hemos, en. But again, you change the stem and all of its forms except for the nosotros form. Vuelvo, vuelves, vuelve, volvemos, vuelven. And how do you know that the stem changes again? You just have to memorize it. You have to remember that volver, you don't say volvo, volves, volve. You have to change that O to UE. You just have to remember. And with practice with these words, you'll start remembering which ones are regular and which ones aren't. Another example is a verb from this chapter. It's the verb dormir. Dormir means to sleep. You say yo duermo, tú duermes, él duerme, nosotros dormimos, ellos duermen, o ustedes duermen. That O changes to UE again, except for in which form? The nosotros form, right. And your endings are IR verb endings, O, S, E, hemos, en. So you're keeping track of two things here. You're keeping track of whether it's an AR verb, an ER verb, or an IR verb like you always have. And now you have to keep track of whether it's a stem changing verb or not. So that is something to remember. That's the second category. We have verbs that stem change from E to IE. We have some verbs that stem change from O to UE. And we have one last category of verbs that stem change. And those are verbs that stem change from E to an I. Now then, there are only a handful of verbs that do this. There's far fewer verbs. And in fact, only IR verbs do this. You won't see AR verbs that stem change from E to IE. You won't see ER verbs that stem change from E to IE. Only IR verbs will do this. Only IR verbs will do this. For example, the verb servir means to serve. Servir. Say it. Servir. Now, as we see before, the stem is going to change. You still have your endings O, S, E, hemos, en, but the E changes to an I here. Sirvo. Everybody say that. Sirvo. Sirves. Sirve. The nosotros form, it's regular. Servimos. Sirven. They serve or y'all serve. Sirvo, sirves, sirve, servimos, sirven. So, that is our third type of stem changing verbs. We have verbs that stem change from E to IE, which can be AR verbs, ER verbs, or IR verbs. We have some verbs that have an O in the stem that changes to UE. There can be AR verbs that do that, ER verbs that do that, IR verbs that do that. And lastly, we have some IR verbs which will stem change from E to an I. Those are the three types of stem changing verbs. All right? Let's review real quick and see what you've understood from this. Let's take a look at our questions. First of all, why do we call these verbs stem changing verbs? Why do they have the name stem changing verbs? Secondly, what do stem changing verbs have in common with regular verbs? What is the same between stem changing verbs and regular verbs? What is not different between the two? Thirdly, how do you know whether a verb changes its stem or not? How do you spot a stem changing verb? How do you know by looking at the infinitive whether a verb is stem changing or not? Fourthly, what are the different ways that a verb can change its stem in Spanish? We talked about several categories. How many categories of stem changing verbs are there, and based on what ways they can stem change? Okay. Number 5, which form of a stem changing verb is always regular? Which form of a stem changing verb does not change its stem? All right, and lastly, what do verbs that stem change from E to I have in common? Remember, we discussed that there's one thing that all of those verbs have in common, the ones that go from E to I. All right, and that is our introduction to stem changing verbs. As we go back to class, we'll practice these more. We'll get some review in class, and we'll be doing some conversation activities using stem changing verbs. If you have any questions on it, review the video several times. If you couldn't answer the review questions, go back over the video until you can. Those are the questions you're expected to know when you return to class the next time and we discuss this.